The morning sun cast long shadows across St. Peter's Square as Queen Isabella adjusted her black lace mantilla one final time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the weight of history she carried on her shoulders. Today would mark the first meeting between a reigning monarch of her nation and the Pope in over 4 centuries, a diplomatic breakthrough that had taken 3 years of careful negotiation to arrange. Cardinal Montenegro stood beside her private car, his weathered face betraying none of the anxiety that had kept him awake for the past week. As the Vatican's Secretary of State, he understood better than anyone the delicate balance required for this unprecedented visit. The Queen represented not just a nation, but a Protestant monarchy meeting with the head of the Catholic Church in what many saw as an impossible reconciliation. "Your Majesty," the cardinal said softly as she stepped from the vehicle, "His Holiness awaits you with great anticipation. This moment has been centuries in the making." Isabella nodded, her blue eyes scanning the ancient architecture that surrounded them. The Sistine Chapel loomed ahead, its Renaissance beauty a stark reminder of the artistic and spiritual divide that had separated their faiths for so long. She had studied every detail of this meeting, every protocol, every possible conversation topic that might arise during their private audience. Behind them, a small convoy of security vehicles had positioned themselves strategically around the square. Swiss guards in their traditional colorful uniforms stood at attention, their ceremonial appearance masking the modern weapons they carried. The Queen's own security detail, dressed in dark suits, blended seamlessly with the Vatican's protective forces, a coordination that had required months of planning. Ambassador Richardson, a tall woman with silver hair and sharp green eyes, walked beside the Queen as they approached the Apostolic Palace. She had served as the primary architect of this historic meeting, navigating the complex web of religious, political, and diplomatic challenges that had made such a visit seem impossible just 5 years earlier. "The Pope speaks fluent English," Richardson whispered as they climbed the marble steps. "He's particularly interested in discussing your nation's efforts in environmental conservation and refugee assistance. These are topics where your governments align closely, despite the religious differences." The halls of the Apostolic Palace gleamed with centuries of artistic achievement. Frescoes by master painters adorned every wall, while marble statues of saints and angels watched over their passage. Isabella found herself momentarily overwhelmed by the beauty and history surrounding her, remembering her childhood lessons about the great schism that had divided Christianity and led to centuries of conflict. Swiss guards opened massive wooden doors, revealing the Pope's private study. The room was surprisingly modest, filled with books, simple furniture, and a large wooden crucifix that dominated one wall. Pope Francis sat behind an ancient oak desk, his warm smile immediately putting the Queen at ease despite the formal circumstances. "Your Majesty," the Pope said, rising from his chair with surprising agility for his age. "Welcome to the Vatican. This is indeed a historic day for both our institutions and our people." Isabella approached the pontiff with the careful steps she had practiced countless times. The protocol for this meeting had been negotiated word by word, gesture by gesture. She would not kneel, as she was not Catholic, but would show appropriate respect for his position as a head of state and spiritual leader of over 1 billion people worldwide. "Your Holiness," she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I'm deeply honored to be here. This meeting represents not just diplomatic progress, but a bridge between our communities that have been separated for far too long." The Pope gestured to a comfortable seating area away from the formal desk, indicating his desire for a more personal conversation. Cardinal Montenegro and Ambassador Richardson took seats at a respectful distance, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to allow private discussion between the two leaders. As they settled into their chairs, the Queen noticed the Pope's eyes. They held a warmth and intelligence that transcended religious boundaries, the eyes of a man who had spent his life serving others regardless of their faith or background. This was not the rigid traditionalist she had been warned about by some advisors, but a modern leader grappling with ancient traditions in a changing world. "I must confess," the Pope said with a gentle smile, "I have followed your nation's work in climate change with great admiration. Your commitment to reducing carbon emissions while maintaining economic growth has been an inspiration to many developing nations struggling with similar challenges." Isabella relaxed slightly, grateful that he had chosen to begin with common ground rather than the theological differences that separated them. "Your own encyclical on environmental stewardship has been influential in our policy discussions," she responded. "We may worship differently, but we share the same earth and the same responsibility to protect it for future generations." Outside the study windows, St. Peter's Square had begun to fill with curious tourists and devoted Catholics hoping to catch a glimpse of this historic meeting. Security personnel moved through the crowds with practiced ease, their presence reassuring but unobtrusive. The world's media had been kept at a respectful distance, but camera crews from dozens of countries waited beyond the barriers for any sign of how the meeting was progressing. The conversation between the Queen and the Pope flowed more naturally than either had expected. They discussed refugee policies, finding remarkable alignment in their approaches to humanitarian assistance. Both had advocated for increased international cooperation in addressing the global migration crisis, and both had faced criticism from hardliners within their own constituencies for their compassionate stances. "Your Majesty," the Pope said after nearly an hour of dialogue, "I would very much like to show you something that I believe will interest you greatly. It relates to a historical connection between your nation and the Vatican that few people know about." Isabella's curiosity was immediately piqued. The historical research conducted in preparation for this visit had been exhaustive, but she wondered what secret the Vatican archives might contain about her country's relationship with the Catholic Church. The Pope rose from his chair, indicating that she should follow him deeper into the Apostolic Palace. They walked through corridors lined with priceless art, past rooms where councils had made decisions that shaped the course of Western civilization. Cardinal Montenegro whispered brief historical notes as they passed particularly significant locations, his expertise in Vatican history evident in every comment. The Pope led them to a private elevator that descended below the main palace level. "The Vatican's secret archives," he explained as they traveled downward, "though we prefer to call them the Vatican Apostolic Archives now. The word secret simply meant private in Latin, but it has caused unnecessary mystery over the centuries. The underground chambers they entered were climate-controlled and filled with documents dating back over 1,000 years. Manuscripts, papal bulls, and historical correspondence filled countless shelves, representing one of the most complete historical records in existence. Scholars from around the world competed for access to these materials, making the Pope's personal tour an extraordinary privilege. "Here," the Pope said, stopping before a particular section of manuscripts, "are documents relating to your nation from the 16th century, during the time of the great religious upheaval. But there are also earlier items from before the separation that tell a different story than what most history books record." He carefully withdrew a leather-bound volume, its pages yellow with age, but remarkably well preserved. Opening it with reverent care, he revealed handwritten text in Latin alongside what appeared to be official seals and signatures. The Queen leaned forward, her knowledge of Latin sufficient to make out some of the key phrases. "This is correspondence," the Pope explained, "between Pope Clement VII and your ancestor, King Edward, from before the final break between Rome and your nation's church. It shows that both men desperately wanted to find a compromise that would preserve unity while addressing the political realities of the time." Isabella studied the documents with growing fascination. The letters revealed a side of history she had never encountered, showing religious and political leaders struggling with impossible choices between personal conviction, political necessity, and spiritual authority. Both the Pope and her ancestor appeared to be men of genuine faith caught in circumstances beyond their control. "History tends to simplify these events," the Pope continued, "but the reality was far more complex. Your ancestor was not the religious revolutionary that many portray him as, and Clement was not the inflexible traditionalist of popular imagination. Both were trying to serve God, while navigating political realities that left them few good options. The implications of this revelation weighed heavily on both leaders as they stood in the quiet archive chamber. If history had taken a slightly different course, if compromise had been possible, the religious wars and persecution that followed might never have occurred. Millions of lives might have been saved, and the Christian world might have remained united. "Your Holiness," Isabella said quietly, "this changes my understanding of our shared history significantly. It suggests that the division between our churches was not inevitable, but the result of circumstances that neither side could fully control." The Pope nodded solemnly. "Which brings us to the present moment and the opportunity we have to heal old wounds, not through theological compromise, which respects neither tradition, but through recognition of our common purpose in serving humanity and protecting God's creation." As they returned to the Pope's study, both leaders carried with them a new understanding of the historical forces that had shaped their relationship and the possibilities that lay ahead for their institutions and peoples. The afternoon sun now streamed through the windows of the Apostolic Palace, casting everything in a golden light that seemed to promise hope for the future. The Queen's security detail had been monitoring the extended meeting with growing concern, but Ambassador Richardson assured them that the lengthy discussion was a positive sign rather than an indication of problems. In diplomatic circles, brief meetings often signaled disagreement, while extended conversations suggested productive engagement. Back in the study, the Pope and Queen resumed their seats, but the atmosphere had changed significantly. The formal diplomatic courtesy of their initial meeting had evolved into something approaching genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of the burdens of leadership in a complex world. "I have a proposal," the Pope said as they settled back into conversation. "Something that could demonstrate our commitment to working together despite our theological differences." The Pope's proposal hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Queen Isabella leaned forward slightly, her diplomatic training keeping her expression neutral while her mind raced through the possibilities and implications of whatever the pontiff was about to suggest. "I'm listening with great interest, Your Holiness," she replied, her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the anticipation building within her. Pope Francis stood and walked to one of the tall windows overlooking St. Peter's Square. The afternoon crowds had grown larger, with pilgrims and tourists from around the world gathering in the hope of witnessing something historic. Many held cameras and phones ready to capture any moment that might emerge from this unprecedented meeting. "Your Majesty," the Pope began, still looking out at the gathered masses, "both of our institutions face similar challenges in the modern world. Young people increasingly view organized religion as irrelevant to their lives. They see division where we preach unity, judgment where we should show mercy, and outdated traditions where we should demonstrate timeless truths." Isabella nodded, thinking of her own nation's declining church attendance and the growing secular movement that questioned the monarchy's traditional relationship with the established church. "The statistics from our religious surveys are indeed troubling," she agreed. "But what do you propose we do about it?" The Pope turned back to face her, his expression animated with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a solution to a long-standing problem. "A joint humanitarian mission, something visible, meaningful, and completely focused on serving those who need help most urgently. Not a theological statement, but a demonstration of faith in action." Cardinal Montenegro shifted in his chair, clearly intrigued, but also concerned about the practical implications of such an unprecedented collaboration. Ambassador Richardson pulled out a small notebook, recognizing that they were moving from diplomatic courtesy into substantive negotiations that would require careful documentation. "I'm thinking specifically," the Pope continued, "of the refugee crisis in the Mediterranean. Thousands of people risk their lives every month trying to reach safety in Europe, fleeing wars, persecution, and poverty. Many die in the attempt, while others face rejection and hostility when they finally reach land. The Queen's eyes widened as she began to understand the scope of what he was proposing. "You're suggesting that we work together to provide assistance to refugees." "More than assistance," the Pope replied, returning to his seat with renewed energy. "I'm proposing that we jointly establish and operate refugee assistance centers in key locations along the Mediterranean coast. Centers that would provide immediate medical care, legal assistance, temporary housing, and coordination with resettlement programs throughout Europe." Isabella felt her pulse quicken as the implications of this proposal became clear. It would be unprecedented for a Protestant monarchy to work directly with the Vatican on such a massive humanitarian undertaking. The political risks were enormous, but so was the potential for positive impact on thousands of human lives. The logistics would be incredibly complex, Ambassador Richardson interjected diplomatically. Two different governmental systems, different legal frameworks, different bureaucratic structures, not to mention the political sensitivities in both our nations. The Pope smiled at her practical concerns. "Cardinal Montenegro has been working with our migrants and refugee section for months on preliminary planning. We believe the challenges are manageable if we approach them systematically and with proper preparation." Cardinal Montenegro cleared his throat and opened a thick folder he had been carrying. "We've identified 3 potential locations," he said, spreading maps and photographs across the coffee table between them. "Lampedusa in Italy, Lesbos in Greece, and a site in southern Spain near the Strait of Gibraltar." The Queen studied the materials, her trained eye quickly assessing the strategic advantages and challenges of each location. Lampedusa was closest to the primary departure points in North Africa, making it ideal for immediate rescue operations. Lesbos had existing infrastructure and experience with refugee assistance, while the Spanish site offered the best access to established resettlement networks. "The beauty of this approach," the Pope explained, "is that it allows us to work together on shared values without compromising our distinct theological positions. We would be serving people of all faiths or no faith, focusing purely on human dignity and the moral obligation to help those in desperate need." Isabella found herself genuinely moved by the vision he was presenting. It would certainly demonstrate to our young people that faith can be a force for positive change in the world, she mused. And it would show that different Christian traditions can cooperate effectively when human lives are at stake. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. A Vatican secretary entered with a tea service, providing a welcome break that allowed everyone to process the magnitude of what was being discussed. As they sipped their tea, the weight of potential history being made settled over the room. "There would need to be complete transparency," Isabella said after several minutes of contemplation. "Full financial disclosure, open media access, independent oversight. Any hint of impropriety or hidden agendas would destroy the credibility of the entire project." "Absolutely," the Pope agreed. "In fact, I would insist on involving other faith communities as well. Islamic organizations, Jewish groups, secular humanitarian agencies. This should be about human unity, not Christian dominance or competition between our churches." Ambassador Richardson was taking detailed notes, already mentally drafting the preliminary agreements that would be necessary to move forward with such an ambitious undertaking. "We would need to brief our respective governments immediately," she said. "This level of commitment would require legislative approval and significant budget allocations." Cardinal Montenegro nodded gravely. "The Vatican has some discretionary funds available, but a project of this scale would require substantial financial partnerships. However, I believe we could attract significant international support once the framework is established." The Pope leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "There is something else we should discuss," he said quietly. "The symbolic importance of this collaboration extends far beyond the immediate humanitarian impact. We would be demonstrating that the religious divisions of the past need not define our future relationships." Isabella understood immediately what he meant. In a world increasingly divided by religious extremism and sectarian violence, a successful partnership between the Vatican and a Protestant monarchy would send a powerful message about the possibility of interfaith cooperation and mutual respect. The timing could hardly be better, she observed. With rising nationalism and religious intolerance in many parts of Europe, a visible demonstration of Christian unity in service of humanitarian goals could have significant political and social impact. The Pope smiled at her insight. Precisely. And by including other faith communities in the work, we show that cooperation is possible across all religious boundaries when human suffering is involved. As the afternoon wore on, their discussion evolved from general concepts to specific implementation strategies. They talked about staffing requirements, training programs for volunteers, coordination with existing international aid organizations, and the complex legal frameworks that would govern operations in multiple countries. The Queen found herself impressed by the depth of planning that had already been undertaken by Vatican officials. They had clearly been thinking about this possibility for months, developing detailed proposals and contingency plans for various scenarios. This was not a spontaneous idea born of diplomatic enthusiasm, but a carefully considered initiative with realistic prospects for success. "One concern I must raise," Isabella said as shadows began to lengthen outside the study windows, "is the potential for criticism from more conservative elements within both our institutions. There will be those who view this cooperation as theological compromise or political opportunism." The Pope nodded soberly. "I've faced such criticism before when reaching out to other faith communities. But I've learned that principled action in service of human dignity tends to win over skeptics when they see the practical results of our work." Cardinal Montenegro added his own perspective from years of navigating Vatican politics. "The key is to frame this properly from the beginning. This is not about theological agreement or institutional merger. It's about two Christian traditions working together to fulfill the common commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves." Ambassador Richardson looked up from her extensive notes. "If we're seriously considering moving forward with this proposal, we need to establish a preliminary timeline and identify the key stakeholders who would need to be consulted in both our systems." The Queen considered the ambassador's practical concern while also weighing the broader implications of what they were contemplating. "I think we should proceed, but carefully and with full transparency at every step," she decided. "This has the potential to be truly transformative, both for the people we would serve and for the relationship between our institutions." The Pope's face lit up with genuine joy at her words. "Then, let us begin the real work of turning this vision into reality," he said, extending his hand toward her in a gesture of partnership that transcended centuries of division and mistrust. As they shook hands, both leaders felt the weight of history and the promise of a different future. Outside, the crowds in St. Peter's Square continued their patient vigil, unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of a collaboration that would reshape interfaith relations and provide hope to thousands of desperate refugees across the Mediterranean. The practical discussions that followed covered everything from legal structures to media strategies, financial frameworks to volunteer recruitment. Both the Queen and the Pope demonstrated the detailed knowledge and strategic thinking that had brought them to positions of global leadership, while their advisors worked to translate grand vision into actionable plans. By late afternoon, they had outlined a preliminary structure for the joint humanitarian initiative and identified the next steps required to move forward. The Queen would need to brief her government and secure parliamentary support, while the Pope would begin consultations with Vatican departments and international Catholic organizations. "This has been the most productive diplomatic meeting of my career," Isabella remarked as they prepared to conclude their historic discussion, "and perhaps the most personally meaningful as well." The Pope smiled warmly. "When we serve others together, we discover that our similarities far outweigh our differences. I believe this partnership will teach both our communities valuable lessons about the true meaning of Christian faith in the modern world." The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across St. Peter's Basilica as Queen Isabella and Pope Francis emerged from the Apostolic Palace together, their historic meeting having evolved into something far more significant than either had anticipated. The crowds in the square had grown throughout the day, with thousands of people now gathered in anticipation of witnessing this unprecedented moment in religious and diplomatic history. Swiss guards formed a protective corridor as the two leaders walked slowly across the ancient stones toward the basilica's entrance. The Queen's security detail maintained their vigilant watch while blending seamlessly with Vatican personnel, a coordination that represented months of careful planning and mutual trust between their respective protection services. "Your Majesty," the Pope said quietly as they approached the massive bronze doors, "I would be honored to show you the Pietà and some of our most treasured artistic masterpieces. These works transcend religious boundaries and speak to the universal human experience of beauty, suffering, and hope." Isabella nodded gratefully, understanding that this invitation represented far more than a simple tour. The Pope was offering to share with her the spiritual and cultural heritage of the Catholic Church, treating her not as an outsider, but as a fellow Christian leader worthy of experiencing these sacred treasures firsthand. As they entered St. Peter's Basilica, the Queen was immediately struck by the overwhelming scale and beauty of the interior. Soaring marble columns supported a ceiling that seemed to reach toward heaven itself, while golden mosaics and Renaissance frescoes covered every surface with scenes of biblical history and Christian devotion. The afternoon light streaming through the massive dome created an almost mystical atmosphere, with dust motes dancing in the colored beams like tiny spirits celebrating their historic meeting. Tourists and pilgrims throughout the basilica paused in their prayers and sightseeing to watch the unprecedented sight of a Protestant monarch being personally escorted by the Pope himself. Michelangelo completed this when he was only 24 years old. The Pope explained as they approached the famous Pietà, protected behind its reinforced glass barrier. It remains the only work he ever signed, and many consider it the finest sculpture ever created. Isabella studied the marble masterpiece with genuine awe, seeing beyond the Catholic imagery to the universal themes of maternal love, grief, and sacrifice that the sculpture embodied. The perfect smoothness of the marble seemed to make the stone figures come alive, with every fold of fabric and expression of emotion rendered in breathtaking detail. "It's extraordinary," she whispered, unconsciously lowering her voice in response to the sacred atmosphere surrounding them. "The technical skill is obvious, but there's something more. An emotional truth that speaks to any parent who has ever worried about their child's safety and well-being." The Pope smiled at her insight. "Exactly. Art at this level transcends sectarian divisions and speaks directly to the human soul. This is why we maintain these treasures not just for Catholics, but for all humanity." As they continued through the basilica, Cardinal Montenegro provided historical context for various artworks and architectural features, his encyclopedic knowledge bringing the centuries of history embedded in the building to vivid life. Ambassador Richardson walked slightly behind, continuing to take detailed notes while also observing the crowd reactions to this extraordinary tour. They paused before Bernini's massive bronze baldachin, the ornate canopy that soared above the papal altar and marked the traditional burial place of St. Peter himself. The twisted bronze columns, decorated with olive branches and cherubic faces, created a dramatic focal point that drew the eye upward toward the dome's golden interior. "This represents something I wanted to discuss with you," the Pope said, gesturing toward the baldachin. "The continuity of faith across generations and cultures. Peter was a fisherman who became the foundation of our church, but his message was always about unity rather than division, love rather than judgment." Isabella understood the deeper meaning behind his words. "You're speaking about the essence of Christian faith that exists beneath all our institutional differences," she replied thoughtfully. "The core message that should unite us rather than the historical disagreements that have divided us." A small group of Vatican officials had gathered at a respectful distance, clearly excited about witnessing this historic encounter between the two Christian leaders. Among them was Archbishop Martinez, the Vatican's Secretary for Relations with States, who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make this meeting possible despite significant political and theological obstacles. "Your Majesty," Archbishop Martinez approached when the Pope gestured him forward, "I wanted to express our gratitude for your willingness to engage in this dialogue. There were many who believed such a meeting could never happen, but your courage and open-mindedness have proved them wrong." The Queen acknowledged his thanks graciously while privately reflecting on the personal risks she had taken in agreeing to this visit. Conservative elements within her own church and government had strongly opposed any formal meeting with the Pope, viewing it as a dangerous precedent that could undermine Protestant independence and theological integrity. As they moved deeper into the Basilica, the Pope shared stories of previous papal meetings with world leaders, describing both the successes and failures of Vatican diplomacy over the centuries. His perspective was remarkably balanced, acknowledging mistakes and missed opportunities alongside the positive contributions the Catholic Church had made to international peace and human rights. "The Church has not always lived up to its highest ideals," he admitted with characteristic honesty. "We have sometimes chosen institutional preservation over moral courage, political advantage over prophetic witness. But we have also learned from these failures and try to do better." Isabella found his candor both refreshing and strategically wise. "My own institution has faced similar challenges," she replied. "The monarchy has had to evolve significantly to remain relevant in a democratic age, and we continue to grapple with the sins of our colonial past and social inequalities that still persist." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a delegation of Vatican officials carrying ornate gift boxes. The Pope had arranged for the presentation of several historic items that would commemorate this unprecedented meeting and symbolize the new relationship they hoped to build between their institutions. "These are copies of manuscripts from our secret archives," the Pope explained as the first box was opened to reveal beautifully bound volumes. "Documents that tell the complete story of the relationship between the Vatican and your nation, including materials that have never been publicly displayed." The Queen examined the manuscripts with obvious fascination, recognizing their immense historical value and the trust that their presentation represented. These were not mere diplomatic gifts, but serious scholarly resources that would enhance understanding of the complex religious and political forces that had shaped European history. The second gift was even more significant: a replica of a 16th century papal ring that had been given to one of her royal ancestors during a brief period of reconciliation between Rome and her nation's church. The original ring had been lost during the religious upheavals that followed, but Vatican artisans had recreated it based on detailed descriptions in historical documents. "This symbolizes our hope for renewed friendship," the Pope said as he presented the ring. "Not a return to the past, which is impossible, but a new beginning based on mutual respect and shared commitment to serving God's people." Isabella accepted the ring with deep emotion, understanding its symbolic importance for both their personal relationship and the broader diplomatic breakthrough they were achieving. "I will treasure this as a reminder of what is possible when leaders choose dialogue over division, cooperation over competition." The formal gift exchange concluded with the Queen presenting her own offerings to the Pope, a collection of contemporary religious art created by artists from her nation, including works by both Protestant and Catholic creators. The pieces represented various artistic styles and theological perspectives, united by their common focus on themes of faith, hope, and social justice. These represent the diversity and creativity of religious expression in our modern society, she explained as the Pope examined each piece with obvious appreciation. They show that artistic inspiration continues to flow from Christian faith, even in our increasingly secular age. The Pope was particularly drawn to a sculpture by a young Catholic artist that depicted the Good Samaritan story using contemporary figures and settings. The traditional parable had been reimagined as a modern urban scene, with the injured traveler represented as a homeless person and the Samaritan as an immigrant helping someone from a different ethnic background. This captures perfectly what we have been discussing, the Pope observed. Faith that expresses itself through practical love and service, crossing boundaries of nationality, race, and social class. This is the kind of Christianity our young people need to see from their leaders. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, the crowds outside St. Peter's Basilica had continued to grow, with news of the historic meeting spreading rapidly through social media and international news networks. Vatican officials estimated that over 50,000 people had gathered in the square, creating a festive atmosphere reminiscent of papal elections or major religious celebrations. The Queen could see through the basilica's windows that television crews from around the world had established positions throughout the square, ready to broadcast whatever images emerged from this unprecedented encounter. The global attention focused on their meeting reinforced her sense of the historic significance of what they were accomplishing. "Your Holiness," she said as they prepared to conclude their tour of the basilica, "I believe we have created something today that will be remembered long after both of us have left our positions of leadership. Not just the humanitarian initiative we discussed, but a new model for how different Christian traditions can relate to each other." The Pope nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, but only if we follow through on our commitments and prove that this cooperation can produce real results for people who desperately need help. Grand gestures and beautiful words mean nothing if they are not backed up by sustained action and genuine sacrifice." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Cardinal Secretary of State Parolin, who had been coordinating with Vatican communications officials about how to present their meeting to the international media. The careful balance between transparency and diplomacy required expert handling to ensure that their message reached intended audiences without creating unintended political complications. "Holy Father," Cardinal Parolin said quietly, "the international press is very eager for some indication of what has been accomplished during your meeting with Her Majesty. We have prepared several possible statements, depending on how much detail you wish to share publicly." The Pope looked to Queen Isabella for her preference regarding media disclosure. "I believe we should be forthcoming about our general areas of agreement, while being appropriately cautious about specific operational details," she suggested. "The world should know that we have found substantial common ground, but premature announcements could complicate our respective approval processes." This diplomatic wisdom impressed everyone present, demonstrating the Queen's sophisticated understanding of international politics and media management. Her suggestion provided a framework for public communication that would build positive momentum without creating unrealistic expectations or political vulnerabilities for either leader. The golden hour of early evening approached as Queen Isabella and Pope Francis prepared to address the massive crowd that had gathered in St. Peter's Square throughout the afternoon. Vatican officials had hastily arranged a temporary speaking platform near the central obelisk, while security personnel worked to establish clear sight lines and safe passage routes through the dense gathering of pilgrims, tourists, and curious Romans who had come to witness this historic moment. Cardinal Montenegro stood beside the platform reviewing the brief remarks that both leaders had agreed to deliver, while Ambassador Richardson coordinated with Vatican communication staff to ensure that international media outlets would have optimal access to record and broadcast their statements. The careful choreography required to manage such an unprecedented public appearance had been improvised throughout the day as the significance of their private meeting became clear. "Your Majesty," the Pope said as they walked together toward the platform, "I want you to know how profoundly this day has affected my own understanding of Christian leadership in the modern world. Our conversations have reminded me that the gospel message is larger than any single institution or theological tradition." Isabella felt deeply moved by his words, recognizing the personal courage it had taken for him to reach across centuries of division and mistrust. "Your Holiness, the wisdom and compassion you have shown today give me great hope for the future of interfaith cooperation. We have proven that differences in worship and doctrine need not prevent us from working together for the common good." As they approached the platform, the crowd's excitement became palpable. Thousands of cameras and smartphones were raised to capture every moment, while television crews from major networks around the world prepared for live broadcasts that would reach hundreds of millions of viewers. The spontaneous gathering had evolved into one of the most widely witnessed religious events of the decade. The Pope gestured for Queen Isabella to speak first, a gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed by diplomatic observers in the crowd. Protocol for such meetings had been negotiated carefully, but the Pope's decision to defer to her demonstrated the genuine partnership they had developed during their hours of private conversation. Isabella approached the microphone with the poise that had been cultivated through decades of public speaking, but also with visible emotion that reflected the historic nature of the moment. The crowd gradually quieted as her voice carried across the ancient stones of the square through the Vatican sound system. "Friends and fellow believers," she began, her voice clear and strong despite the magnitude of the audience. "Today I have experienced something I never expected when I first accepted the invitation to visit His Holiness Pope Francis here in the Vatican. I came as the representative of a Protestant nation, carrying centuries of religious and political history that separated our traditions." The crowd listened intently, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in modern religious history. In the gathered masses were Catholics from every continent, Protestant pilgrims who had traveled specifically to witness this meeting, and countless others whose faith backgrounds spanned the full spectrum of Christian belief and practice. "What I discovered," the Queen continued, "was not the theological adversary that some had warned me to expect, but a fellow Christian leader whose heart beats with the same desire to serve God's people and care for the most vulnerable members of our human family. We have found far more that unites us than divides us." A spontaneous cheer erupted from sections of the crowd, quickly spreading throughout the square as people recognized the historic significance of her words. The Queen paused to allow the enthusiasm to build before continuing with the more substantive portions of her address. "His Holiness, and I have discussed concrete ways that our institutions can work together to address the refugee crisis that continues to unfold across the Mediterranean region. We are committed to moving beyond mere dialogue to practical cooperation that will save lives and provide hope to those who have lost everything in their search for safety and freedom." This announcement generated even more enthusiastic response from the crowd, particularly from groups of young people who had grown frustrated with religious institutions that seemed more focused on internal debates than external service. The Queen's words offered them a vision of faith that expressed itself through action rather than argument. "We do not pretend that our theological differences have disappeared," Isabella acknowledged, "nor do we suggest that institutional unity is possible or even desirable. But we declare together that Christian love compels us to work across denominational boundaries when human lives are at stake and human dignity is threatened." Pope Francis stepped forward to the microphone as the Queen concluded her remarks, his face radiating the joy that had characterized their entire day together. The crowd's response to his appearance was immediately warm and enthusiastic, reflecting the deep affection that millions of Catholics felt for his papacy and his commitment to social justice. "My dear brothers and sisters," he began in English, though his accent gave his words a musical quality that enhanced their emotional impact. "Today we have witnessed something beautiful, something that gives me great hope for the future of Christianity in our troubled world." The Pope's words carried across the square with the authority of someone who had spent his life serving others, but also with the humility that had made him beloved by people of many different faith backgrounds. His ability to communicate across cultural and linguistic barriers had been evident throughout his papacy, and it was particularly powerful in this historic moment. Her Majesty Queen Isabella has shown us that the walls that divide Christians are built by human hands and can be torn down by human hearts filled with God's love. She has crossed the bridge of centuries to extend the hand of friendship, and we have grasped it with gratitude and joy. The crowd's enthusiasm continued to build as the Pope's words were simultaneously translated into multiple languages through headphones distributed throughout the square. Vatican organizers had not anticipated such international interest in the meeting, but they had responded quickly to accommodate the diverse linguistic needs of the unexpected gathering. Together, the Pope continued, "We will show the world that followers of Jesus Christ can work together despite our differences. We will serve refugees not because they share our faith, but because they share our humanity. We will build bridges not to compromise our beliefs, but to better live out the gospel's command to love our neighbors as ourselves." As both leaders stood together on the platform, the late afternoon sun created dramatic lighting that photographers around the world would later describe as providential. The image of the Protestant Queen and the Catholic Pope standing side by side would become one of the most reproduced photographs of the year, symbolizing hope for religious cooperation in an increasingly polarized world. Dr. Sarah Williams, a theology professor from Cambridge University who had traveled to Rome specifically to witness this historic meeting, found herself deeply moved by what she was experiencing. "I never thought I would live to see something like this," she confided to her colleague. This could be a turning point not just for Catholic-Protestant relations, but for the entire future of organized Christianity. Similar reactions were evident throughout the crowd as people of all ages and backgrounds processed the significance of what they were witnessing. Many had brought small cameras to document their presence at this historic event, understanding instinctively that they were participating in something that would be remembered and studied for generations to come. The Queen and Pope concluded their public remarks by announcing a joint prayer for peace, refugees, and the healing of religious divisions. As they bowed their heads together, the massive crowd fell into respectful silence, creating a moment of profound spiritual unity that transcended the differences in their worship styles and theological traditions. "Almighty God," the Pope prayed aloud, "we thank you for bringing us together across the barriers that human beings have created. Help us to see your face in every refugee who seeks safety, every child who hungers for food, every person who yearns for dignity and respect." Queen Isabella joined the prayer, her voice blending with the Pope's in a harmonious expression of shared faith and common purpose. "Grant us wisdom to turn our good intentions into effective action, courage to face criticism from those who prefer division to unity, and strength to persevere when the work becomes difficult and the results seem slow in coming." As the prayer concluded, church bells throughout Rome began to ring in a spontaneous celebration organized by various parish priests who had been following the day's events through television and radio coverage. The sound of dozens of bells echoing across the ancient city created an atmosphere of joy and hope that matched the mood of the crowd in St. Peter's Square. The formal conclusion of the public ceremony did not mark the end of the historic day's events. Vatican officials had arranged for a private dinner that would allow the Queen, the Pope, and their key advisors to continue their planning discussions in a more relaxed setting, while also providing an opportunity for personal conversation away from the pressure of diplomatic protocol. As they walked back toward the Apostolic Palace, both leaders reflected on the unexpected direction their meeting had taken. What had begun as a formal diplomatic courtesy had evolved into a genuine partnership with the potential to reshape interfaith relations and provide tangible assistance to some of the world's most vulnerable populations. "Your Holiness," Isabella said quietly as they climbed the marble steps, "I believe we have started something today that will outlive both of our tenures in office. The partnership we have formed will require sustained effort from our successors, but the foundation we have laid is strong enough to support that long-term commitment." The Pope nodded thoughtfully, already thinking ahead to the practical challenges of implementing their ambitious humanitarian initiative. "The real test will come the months ahead as we transform these ideals into operational reality. But I have great confidence in the people who will carry out this work, and even greater confidence in the God who has called us to serve together." The private dining room in the Apostolic Palace had been prepared with meticulous attention to both diplomatic protocol and personal comfort, featuring an intimate table setting that would allow Queen Isabella, Pope Francis, and their closest advisors to continue their historic conversations in a relaxed atmosphere. Crystal glasses caught the warm light from antique chandeliers, while Renaissance paintings on the walls served as silent witnesses to centuries of papal diplomacy and international relations. Cardinal Montenegro had worked with Vatican chefs to prepare a menu that respected both the Queen's dietary preferences and the Pope's well-known commitment to simple, sustainable food choices. The meal would feature ingredients sourced from Vatican gardens and local Italian producers, reflecting the environmental consciousness that had emerged as one of the strongest areas of agreement between the two leaders throughout their day of discussions. Your Majesty, Pope Francis said as they were seated, I hope you will forgive the informality of this setting compared to the grand state dinners you must regularly attend. I have always believed that the most important conversations happen when people can speak freely without the burden of excessive ceremony. Isabella smiled warmly at his words, clearly appreciating the opportunity to continue their dialogue in a more personal setting. Your Holiness, this is actually refreshing after years of formal diplomatic meals where protocol often prevents genuine communication. I suspect we will accomplish more this evening than at most official banquets I have attended. Ambassador Richardson and Cardinal Montenegro took seats that allowed them to participate in the conversation while also providing their respective leaders with quiet counsel when needed. Both had filled multiple notebooks throughout the day with details that would need to be developed into formal agreements and implementation plans in the weeks ahead. As the first course was served, the Pope raised his glass of water in a toast. To new beginnings, he said simply, and to the hope that our children will inherit a world where religious differences inspire cooperation rather than conflict. The Queen raised her own glass, her eyes reflecting both the satisfaction of the day's accomplishments and awareness of the challenges that lay ahead. To the courage to cross ancient boundaries and the wisdom to build bridges that will benefit generations yet to come. Their conversation during dinner ranged widely across topics, both personal and political, revealing the depth of understanding they had developed during their hours together. They discussed their respective paths to leadership, the loneliness that often accompanies positions of great responsibility, and their shared concerns about the future of organized religion in an increasingly secular world. I often wonder, the Queen confided as they enjoyed the main course, whether young people today see our institutions as relevant to their lives and concerns. The statistics on religious participation in my country are quite troubling, particularly among university-educated young adults. The Pope nodded gravely, having grappled with similar challenges throughout his papacy. This is precisely why I believe our collaboration is so important, he replied. Young people are hungry for authentic spirituality that expresses itself through service to others. They are less interested in theological debates than in seeing faith make a practical difference in addressing injustice and suffering. Cardinal Montenegro contributed his own observations from extensive travel throughout Europe and encounters with young Catholic leaders. The enthusiasm we saw in the square today, particularly among younger people, suggests that they respond positively when they see Christian leaders working together rather than emphasizing their differences. Ambassador Richardson added her perspective from years of diplomatic service in various international contexts. The refugee crisis offers an ideal opportunity to demonstrate Christian unity because it touches on fundamental human values that transcend denominational boundaries. Compassion, justice, and human dignity are concepts that resonate across religious and secular audiences. As the evening progressed, their discussion became increasingly detailed about the practical aspects of implementing their proposed humanitarian initiative. They talked through staffing requirements, funding mechanisms, legal frameworks, and coordination with existing international aid organizations. The complexity of the undertaking became more apparent as they explored each component, but so did their shared determination to make it succeed. We will need to establish clear chains of command and decision-making authority, the Queen observed, drawing on her experience with complex governmental operations. The initiative must function efficiently even when political tensions arise between our respective nations or institutions. The Pope agreed enthusiastically, having learned from previous Vatican diplomatic efforts that good intentions were insufficient without proper organizational structures. I propose that we establish a joint oversight board with representatives from both our institutions, plus external members from other faith communities and secular humanitarian organizations. This would ensure transparency and broad-based support while maintaining our shared leadership. Cardinal Montenegro pulled out organizational charts he had been developing throughout the day, showing potential structures for the joint operation. We envision regional coordination centers in each target location, with local directors reporting to the Joint Oversight Board. This would allow for rapid response to changing conditions while maintaining overall strategic coherence. The Queen studied his proposals carefully, her experience with large-scale governmental operations evident in the questions she asked about accountability measures, performance evaluation, and crisis management protocols. We must be prepared for criticism and political attacks, she warned. There will be those who view our cooperation as betrayal of our respective traditions, and they will scrutinize every decision for evidence of compromise or weakness. This sobering reminder led to extended discussion about public relations strategies and communication frameworks that would help maintain popular support for their initiative while also educating their respective constituencies about its importance. Both leaders understood that sustainable cooperation would require ongoing effort to build understanding and counter inevitable opposition. The key, Pope Francis observed, is to let our actions speak louder than our words. When people see refugees being rescued, children receiving medical care, and families being reunited, the theological debates will seem less important than the human results of our cooperation. As dessert was served, Vatican musicians provided soft background music that enhanced the warm atmosphere of their extended conversation. The Queen commented appreciatively on the beauty of the chamber music, noting that artistic expression had served throughout history as a bridge between different cultures and religious traditions. Music and art have always transcended the boundaries that divide us politically and theologically, she observed. Perhaps our humanitarian centers could also serve as venues for cultural exchange and artistic collaboration between people from different backgrounds. The Pope's eyes lit up at this suggestion, seeing immediate possibilities for expanding their initiative beyond immediate humanitarian assistance to longer-term community building and cultural understanding. Yes, this could become a model for how refugee integration might work more effectively throughout Europe. Not just providing temporary assistance, but creating genuine communities where newcomers and established residents can learn from each other. Their conversation was briefly interrupted by the arrival of Vatican Communications Director Father Martinez, who brought updates on international media coverage of the day's events. Television networks around the world were providing extensive coverage of their meeting, with generally positive commentary about the historic nature of their cooperation and the potential implications for international relations. The response from religious leaders worldwide has been overwhelmingly positive, Father Martinez reported. We have received supportive statements from Anglican, Lutheran, Orthodox, and even some Islamic and Jewish organizations. The World Council of Churches has already expressed interest in supporting your humanitarian initiative. Ambassador Richardson smiled at this news, having anticipated that successful Catholic-Protestant cooperation might encourage broader interfaith collaboration. This could become a catalyst for much more extensive religious cooperation on global challenges, she suggested. Climate change, poverty reduction, conflict resolution, all areas where faith communities could potentially work together more effectively. As the evening drew toward its conclusion, both leaders reflected on the unexpected transformation of what had begun as a routine diplomatic meeting. Neither had anticipated the depth of personal connection they would develop or the ambitious scope of the cooperation they would ultimately envision together. Your Holiness, Queen Isabella said, as they prepared to conclude their dinner, I want you to know that this has been one of the most meaningful days of my reign. not just because of the diplomatic breakthrough we have achieved, but because of the personal friendship we have formed and the hope it gives me for the future of Christian leadership. Pope Francis stood and walked around the table to embrace the Queen warmly, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier, but now felt completely natural given the relationship they had developed. "My dear sister in Christ," he said with obvious emotion, "today we have planted seeds that will grow into a harvest of peace and justice that we may not live to see, but our children will surely benefit from." As they prepare to part, both leaders committed to maintaining regular personal communication as they worked to transform their shared vision into operational reality. They agreed to meet again within 6 months to evaluate progress and address whatever challenges had emerged in implementing their ambitious humanitarian partnership. The Queen's departure from the Vatican took place under dramatically different circumstances than her arrival that morning. Instead of the formal diplomatic courtesy that had characterized the beginning of their meeting, she left as a true partner and friend, carrying with her not just ceremonial gifts, but concrete plans for cooperation that could reshape interfaith relations and provide hope to thousands of desperate refugees. As her motorcade made its way through the Roman streets toward the airport, Queen Isabella reflected on the profound personal and political transformation she had experienced during this single day. She had come to the Vatican as a Protestant monarch fulfilling a diplomatic obligation, but she was leaving as a Christian leader who had discovered the possibility of unity without uniformity, cooperation without compromise of principle. The lights of Rome sparkled in the darkness as her plane lifted off for the journey home, but the illumination she carried with her was far brighter than any earthly city could provide. In just one day, centuries of division had been replaced by a partnership that promised hope for both their institutions and the countless people they were called to serve together.